Are we on? 7 seconds already.
There it is again.
Good morning.
Morning, everyone. Welcome. Sunday morning. It's weekend. Well, it's almost the end of the weekend, but still it's Sunday.
Still, Sundays are great.
Yeah, it's a great day. And thanks for joining us again today. We are in our long series about Genesis. I think we're about halfway or so. Genesis 11 and 12 today. I hope it's been quite interesting, reframing the way we look at it. And it's called Genesis Through Ancient Eyes, okay? Because we're trying to look at Genesis through the context as far as possible. And we're trying to kind of separate ourselves from modern traditional ideas that make us think. Yeah, but it's the ideas that make us think those ancient people thought like us, and so it's easy to interpret what they're saying because we just take it for what it says. But we need a bit of context to understand what's going on. So last week we were in the chapters concerning Noah and the flood, right? Not going to do a long recap at all, but it seems like the Israelites rewrote the flood accounts because they are older versions, Assyrian and Babylonian versions of these flood accounts that we now know of, that the church for hundreds and just over 1,000 years never knew about. So now we know about them, and now we can reinterpret what we see in Genesis according to that. So the crux of the story for last week was basically just that there were other ancient flood narrative accounts. And that Noah and the Ark, the Bible story we get in Sunday school, is an Israelite adapted version of those older Babylonian versions. And like with some of the other scenes we've seen, the Israelites are reframing the stories to explain how they understand their God. The first point they're making is that it's not some Enu or some Enlil or some other ancient God that's doing all of this. It's their God, Yahweh. He brings the flood, but he doesn't do it because people are making a lot of noise, like in the Babylonian accounts. He does it because people aren't living to the proper standard. And so in the Noah account, it's basically portrayed as humans get so wicked that there's no good left, that God has to intervene, kills everybody, all the animals as well. We have two stories in there, doublet, that come from two different traditions, one including clean animals, the other one doesn't. So you can think, one includes clean animals. I wonder who would like to include clean animals, probably like a priestly type of community that would write that type of story. But in the end, the Israelites are reframing and they're adapting ancient stories, many times Babylonian. And once again, I want to just remind you of this, that a lot of this stuff is anti-Babylonian rhetoric. And one of the reasons for that was the time during which all these stories come together and it's redacted and put together into the Torah as we understand now is the 6th century BC. And who's ruling the 6th century BC? It's the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And so the Israelites going into exile would have to counter all these stories, and they write different versions of them. So we see in Genesis 1 account, and we saw definitely in the Noah and the Ark story. And today will be another tick on the list of stories that are countering Babylonian ideas. So today we're going to be speaking about the Tower of Babel. Tower of Babel, famous story. You know the story. You've been to Sunday school, and Sunday school they taught you the story.
Where languages came from.
That's where language comes from. Languages comes from the Tower of Babel. Needless to say, that's not where languages come from. Languages evolve, and that's just not where languages come from. So. But what do we make then of an ancient Israelite from the 6th century writing about where languages come from? A very interesting scenario here that we're going to be exploring today. But I think I want to make sure you know that this is, again, an anti-Babylonian rhetoric. So as we go through Genesis, you'll realize there's a lot of anti-Babylonian rhetoric. And that makes perfect sense to us because it's the time in which the Babylonians are crushing Jerusalem and taking the elite, the writers, those who were educated enough to write. Very few people could read and write at that time. They taken into exile, and there they're writing their own story for their children and children's children. And they are reflecting Babylonian ideas, but rewriting them for their God and their way of life and so on. It does actually, the more you read this, it makes a lot of sense. Maybe a good example before I go, because today's a little bit short. If you had a husband, Tori, but you don't, that was cheating on you, and he just came home one day and he had a little bit of lipstick on his collar, and you ask him, what's that lipstick? And you say to him, oh, and he says to you, no, I was walking, and this one lady at work, you know her, what's her name, blah, blah, blah. She came past, she fell, and her lipstick got there, and that's what happened. You tend to believe your husband, right? So then the next day he comes back and he's smelling like someone else's perfume, and he's got another story for that. And then the day after that, he's late from work, and you see a receipt for a hotel room on his credit card statement, and he's got a story for that. And the first story you might believe, the second story you might believe, but in the end, if these things keep stacking up and up and up and up, eventually you come to the conclusion something's really fishy here. This guy's having an affair. And kind of the same thing happens when we read Genesis. Taking these stories in isolation, you could provide a counter argument. No, it's not people writing from the exile. These are real ancient 3rd millennium BC Israelites writing. But if you take all of it together, it works that the husband's having an affair. That's what's going on here. So today's another kind of a tick in that list in terms of anti-Babylonian rhetoric. All right, so what happens after the flood? Right, we have Noah. Noah starts again like a second Adam. There's nobody on earth now, according to the story, right? Not even the Adam and Eve story leaves us with no one on earth, right? Cain goes and he's afraid of other people and gets a wife from the other nations. But after Noah, everyone's dead. So it's only Noah left. And Noah's got 3 sons that went on him with the boat. All right? And so they are Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And so the next part in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 10, is the story of how these 3 boys go out and they populate the whole earth again. Interestingly enough, that's how the languages of the world come to be, through all these different nations. All right, so let me just read from here. After getting the boot, after getting off the boat, Noah plants a vineyard.
Oh, he got the boot off the earth.
No, after Noah gets off the boat, he plants a vineyard, right? He gets plastered. He's drunk, and his boys discover him drunk. Unluckily for his one boy, Ham walks in, sees him naked, runs out and tells the other brothers. When the other 2 brothers come in, they walk in backwardsly not to see him naked. And this act of running in and seeing his dad naked, for this, him and the rest of all his children are cursed forever. Okay. All right. That's a bit harsh. And so Noah then curses this boy that saw him naked. Now, I know you've heard this story many times, but if you think about this logically, it's a bit extreme. It sounds like someone's trying to justify something else. And in fact, that's actually what's going on here. Because from Ham, guess who we get from Ham? Egyptians, Cushites, Babylonians, Philistines, and the Canaanites. All the major enemies of Israel come from this poor guy who ran in and saw his dad naked.
You think there could have been another reason why he was so cursed, in the story.
But what makes sense?
Because he didn't do anything intentionally wrong.
Exactly. So, but what does make sense, if someone is writing from a later time and justifying why all these nations are their enemies, why they are so cursed, and why they have to be fought.
I understand. I'm saying, but the reason, the thing that he did wrong couldn't have been a bit more intentional.
Yeah. Yes.
I'm just saying, it's of all things that
terrible.
His whole bloodline was cursed for, or thereafter was for accidentally stumbling upon his drunk dad.
And think about the 4th generation from him. What did they do wrong?
Yeah.
They didn't do anything wrong. So the point is that this is a justification that's written in reverse of the nations that Israel is in conflict with at a later stage, a justification for why they have to take in Canaan and basically decimate the people that's in Canaan. These are the cursed people. Oh yeah, they were cursed because Ham didn't respect his father. But anyway, God has cursed them through Noah, and so it's okay if we get rid of these guys. The Egyptians, the same. The Babylonians, the same. So Canaan then becomes the slave. Ham becomes the slave of his two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Of course, the Israelites come from Shem. And in this blessing and cursing, the Israelites are the ones who are blessed. Japheth is like in the middle. He works with Shem, but Cain or Ham is the one that gets absolutely cursed and is forced to be the slave of Shem. And so this is a backwards writing of the ideology that the nations around Israel have to serve them and that they will rule over those nations. So it's writing into the history books a justification for this position that they find themselves in.
For this entitlement.
Yes, to some degree. So to get this straight, the Canaanites as a people are cursed because Ham saw his dad naked. Now, it doesn't really make a lot of sense then, unless we realize that this is a story told from a much later time, from the perspective of much later Israelites who would fight and struggle against the Canaanites for their land and for their promised land. So the Canaanites play a major role in the future of the Israelites. You know that. The Canaanites would be the people who would need to be exterminated in the conquest of the promised land. And so there's some form of justification that's written into the history books here. Why can they be? Why is it okay that they be exterminated? Because they are the cursed people because of their disrespect towards Noah. Although that still seems a bit ridiculous from modern times, it would have carried a lot more weight in the patriarchal era. Okay. So the flood story then is a vehicle for talking about how Israel's God is different from the other gods, but it also explains why they justify the hatred for the Canaanites. Justifying the things that they then later have to do to them, right? Fight them. But as we all know, the extermination of the Canaanites as recorded in Judges is quite it's actually a disturbing thing, a disturbing event in which God commands the Israelites to go and kill everything, kids, babies, everything, just completely exterminate them because they are idolaters. Gone, right. So they were cursed from the very beginnings, and it is now the Israelites' duty to remove them. So you can understand what's going on. So Noah and his sons then, they fill the world, and from them there's a list of 70 nations that come out of Noah. Now, if you know the Bible, you'll understand that 70 is not a number to be taken lightly, but at the same time, that means it's also not a literal number. 70 elders under Moses, 70 nations. What's another number for 70? The 70 that went out in the New Testament, the 70 disciples going out 2 by 2. And I've got some more examples, for instance, in the Council of the Gods in the ancient, I think it's the Ugaritic, the Canaanite pantheon. There were 70 other gods that were like children to the high god and his wife. These are symbols and ideas that we find right throughout the scriptures and also the ancient world. Okay, so now we get to Genesis 10. That was just a quick intro. So Genesis 10 starts with our chapter separator. These are the descendants of, right? And this is the fourth one. If you're joining us for the first time, these chapter separators are not according to our chapters, which were added in the Middle Ages, but were the ancient, seems to be the ancient, not chapter separations, but section separators in the book of Genesis. There's a long list of names there that we always skip over, but it's important to the Israelites they record it because it helps them trace their lineage back through to Noah, Shem, which is important. From Shem, of course, we get the idea of Semitic, Semitic people, Semites, which is the line of then Israel. Okay, so in this list of names, and I read through it properly again. We have Japheth, which is I call him the middle son, not the blessed one, not the cursed one, but the in-between one. From him come 14 nations, and they, as far as I can understand, they are the nations that occupy areas today known as Turkey, Greece. Right, so it's up in the northern parts. And then we have from Ham. Now remember, Ham is the cursed one. Excuse me. And we have from Ham pretty much everyone that gives Israel trouble, which is, okay, it's not a coincidence. I don't believe it's a coincidence. But it is interesting that they write it this way, that everyone that's their enemy or was their enemy from the time beginning till now in the 6th century, they come from Ham because they are cursed. So our enemies are cursed. It's very much an idea that a lot of people still employ today. I think like in cultic circles where everybody outside is cursed because they're not from us, and it's the same type of idea that's playing itself out here. So from them, we get about 30 that are mentioned here in Genesis 10, and the list includes the Canaanites, right, the age-old enemies. We have the Egyptians, which is the ones who take Israel into slavery, right, and later on, Israel wants to rely on Egypt when Assyria comes against them in the 8th century. Egypt is always that worldly power that you are tempted to ally with. We have the Assyrians, which is the people that actually destroy the 10 northern tribes of Israel in the 8th century and comes to destroy Judah, but just doesn't get to do that. And then we have our famous Babylonians. Also, they come from this lineage of Ham. Right, okay. So finally from Shem, which we get the word Semitic, we have the people group from which the Israelites come. Now, so this list focuses our attention to Shem's family, and that is what brings us to the most important character in Genesis, Abraham. So by the time we get to Genesis 12, we meet Abraham. We're going to be talking about Abraham today because Abraham, in a very interesting way, connects to the Tower of Babel. So that's where we're going to be heading today, and I think that's going to be the most important and the most interesting part of this discussion today. The point is, we have one chapter from Noah to Abraham. Like, it's really, really short. It just tells us that Noah splits into a cursed peoples, the Japheth nations, and the blessed peoples, from where Israel comes, and that's where Abraham comes out of. Okay, so let me just see where I am down here. Right. So the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they settle in Shinar, and this becomes an important word for us because it's where we understand the Tower of Babel from. Right. So what we have, if you understand the ancient history also of that area, Mesopotamia, it used to be the old lands of Sumerians, then Akkadians, then Assyrians, and then Babylonians, right? And then there's a new Babylonian empire, there's an old Babylonian empire. And it's good to familiarize yourself to some degree. I'm familiar to some degree with how these nations develop. Often an empire is not a bunch of new people, it's just taking over the old people. So anyway, so it's kind of dealing with the same area. But the interesting part is this, that Abraham comes from Ur. Ur was one of the 3 major cities of the ancient civilization in Mesopotamia. Now, Abraham is dated, according to the literal biblical chronology, to about 2000 BC. Is kind of around there, plus or minus 100 years, is when Abraham kind of leaves Ur of the Chaldeans. He goes with his dad, they go up north to Haran, and then from there, Abraham comes to the Promised Land. Okay, so what's the significance of Abraham being from Ur of the Chaldeans? This is right next to Babylon. It's today's Iraq, and Baghdad, of course, is the city of Babylon, and Ur is really, really close. That's the Babylonian area which Abraham is from. We'll speak about that in a moment. So, before we get to Abraham, the writer takes one weird little turn. Chapter 11 is a weird little insertion because you could have gone straight from Shem, bringing us to Abraham, into the story of Abraham. But the writers or the redactors, it feels like they're inserting the story of Genesis 11, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. All right, why? Why do they insert the story of the Tower of Babel? And I think today...
Must be because Abraham spoke a different language.
Well, possibly. No, well, I mean, it could be part of it. I thought they were trying to
explain why he...
Well, yeah, possible, but I don't think it's the main crux of what's going on here. So what is really weird about Genesis 11, the story of the Tower of Babel, is this. When you read Genesis 10, it gives you the list of the names of the nations that come. And then it says, these nations, each according to their land and their language. And then the next one, each according to their land and their language. So from Noah, you have Shem, Japheth, and Ham, and they go out and they populate the known world. If you go map out all of this is pretty much the Mediterranean, ancient Mediterranean area, north, Egypt, Kush, and then across into Assyria, Babylon to the east. And then Genesis 11 starts like this. Now the world had one language and the same words. What? No, hold on. You just told us all the nations spread out and they had their own language. Now you're saying the world had the same language. This is weird, right? This is interesting. Now, most scholars will look at this immediately and say this is a different tradition and it's an insertion. It's a different version of how language is developed, right? And I think that my gut is that that's probably what's going on here. But the story is important enough that they wanted to add it in, and it must have some real value here that they would take the risk to you looking at this and say, this is a contradiction. Right? Now, in the Noah story, we saw the same type of thing, right? At the risk of contradiction, they don't care. They bring the stories together because the stories are making theological statements. They are not there to give us accurate, perfect history. They are there to make theological statements. So Genesis 11 starts with the whole earth had the same language. What the heck? I thought all the 70 nations just went out and they had their own language already. Well, no. Okay. So once again, we need to set our focus on understanding the vantage point from which these stories are told. This is not carelessness by the redactors or the editors. This is put together by Israelites that were held captive by Babylonians, as in the Tower of Babylonians. All right. So firstly, Tower of Babel seems to be a play on words because I think Balal is the Hebrew, means confusion. But Babel is obviously a nod to Babylon, right? And it's in the area of Babylon. So why in the world would Israelites single out again a story about the Babylonians and the towers they built? Well, there must surely be, and I think this is what becomes quite clear as you walk into the story. Once again, this contrast that needs to be highlighted between how the Babylonians do things and how the Israelites do things. So the story of the Tower of Babel goes something like this. The people with one language, they settle in the plain of Shinar. If you go back to chapter 10, Shinar is where the Babylonians settled. So this is obviously a story, again, about the Babylonians, right? Possibly being written in Babylon or after a return from Babylon. So we have the same case. It's an anti-Babylonian rhetoric that's being pushed here. Okay. The post-flood group comes together. They want to build a tower. Right? This tower must reach the heavens. Now, in the ancient context, and this is rather important, but during this time, the Babylonians were building towers. All right. And in fact, if you go to Iraq, guess where? One of the most significant ancient towers called ziggurats, is still there. All right, we can tell the story about this particular ziggurat, but it's highly interesting that it's still in Ur of the Chaldeans. But let's put that to the side. The Babylonians, Assyrians, they built these things. They were like pyramids. It's like a pyramid, but it has levels. So you build up, come in, and then go up again, come in and go up again, and these long staircases that go all the way up. This particular ziggurat in Ur was, as far as we know, we don't know the full height because much of it's been destroyed, but above 30 meters high. That's big, Tori. Like it's really, really huge. And so these ziggurats were sacred spaces. They were for the gods. They were often part of temple complexes. So in some cases, the ziggurat was the place where the god would come down and then go into the temple. it was not a place where people would walk up and, like today, tourists run up and see, oh, what's it like in here? It's completely sacred and dangerous, and it wasn't for people at all. It was a kind of like a staircase, holy staircase for the gods to come down into, and then come and inhabit the temples that were part of the complexes. Other times, the temples were at the very top of these ziggurats. That's where the gods lived. Now, remember, in the ancient world, the gods were not the way we think of God today, spirits somewhere very far removed. They were human-like in the sense that they needed homes, they needed food, and the ancient peoples built them staircases, built them homes, and fed them, and that's where the idea of sacrifices come from. And in return for that service, the gods would look after the harvests, protect them in war, and so on. And so in the ancient Mesopotamian areas, the gods made humans as slaves, and that was the job of the humans, was to look after the gods, and then the god would reciprocate. Okay, so we have a lot of information about these ziggurats. They are written in Akkadian, about them, written in Akkadian tablets, which we've now deciphered. So we know their names, we know where they were. So it's a very interesting story that this Tower of Babel, most probably, there's really no other historical explanation, that it was a form of a ziggurat that was built in Babylon. And we know that Babylonians built these things, right? Okay. The ancient structure was known as a ziggurat. It's well known from archaeological discoveries. It's a common structure of worship in the ancient world. Since the gods were up there, building a stairway-like structure was an attempt to get to the gods, or for the gods to then come down. But in contrast to the Babylonian go-up efforts, the Israelite worship didn't have ziggurats. They built temples, and God always used to come down in the temple, if we read the Israeli literature. So there's already a contrast that's being painted here. The Babylonians are trying to get to God. That's the wrong way to worship God. The right way is the Israelite way, for the Israelites, that God will come down. You don't go up there trying to go fetch him. You build his house, and he will come and inhabit that house. And you know, that's what we see. So the Babylonians had their share of ziggurats, and the account seems to be a belittling of the Babylonian arrogance and pride for thinking that they could reach the gods, right? So the Israelites are writing, saying to their own people, we don't do things like this. The Babylonians do things like this. We don't agree with this way. Our way is the right way. God's response to the story, of course, is very interesting. God does come down, which is exactly what would have happened in the ancient world. They believed the gods come down to those places. He sees the high-rise building, and he is to prevent the people and scatter them across the earth. So,
to prevent the people from being scattered around that earth.
Excuse me.
I'm not sure I understand.
It is exactly what happens. Sorry, there might be a little misprint here. But anyway, so the point is that God does then come down. But the result for the Babylonians is not what they wanted. They wanted to build a name for themselves, extra special, maybe favoritism from the gods. But Yahweh comes down. And the result of this ziggurat is not what the Babylonians expected. They get scattered and get absolute confusion reign between them, so they can no longer build. And this is how they all get their different languages, etc. We know the story. So the story is about God coming to disrupt Babylonian religion, right? That's kind of what's going on. Okay, so this story is not a historical account of where languages come from, but is clever political satire against Babylon and its religious system, and their arrogant attempts to get to the gods. But it also positions us perfectly to move to the story of Abraham. So think about this. We already have in Genesis 10, from Noah came all these nations, all their names, all their languages, and where they settled. Chapter 12 is Abraham, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And what is inserted in chapter 11 is the story of a ziggurat in Babylon that is an anti-Babylonian rhetoric. Now, how does that connect to Abraham? Well, we know where Abraham was from according to the Israelite story. Abraham was from Ur in the Chaldeans, right? And it just so happens, and this is what I'm going to give you now is historical information, archaeological information. I'm not saying that the Israelites are writing in direct response to this historical timeline and the events I'm about to mention, but I think it's terribly interesting. And it can't be a coincidence. It is actually a historical timeline for ziggurats from that survived to this day and that were rebuilt and restored, guess when? In the 6th century. Okay, so I've got a little bit of historic information here. I want to tell you about the ziggurat that's in Ur of the Chaldeans. If you go to Ur, you can still go find it there. I don't think Ur is still called Ur, but whatever it is called today. Right, so just quickly on ziggurat. Ziggurats are buildings, the root word means to build high. That's the point of it, right? They are massive type of structure that were built in the ancient Mesopotamia, right? It has the form of a terrace compound with successively receding stories or levels. Notable ziggurats include, first on the list, the Great Ziggurat of Ur. Okay, that's the first thing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. The place Abraham was from had one of the, as far as we know, the greatest and best ziggurats of the ancient world. That could answer the question of why put a story of a ziggurat right before we get to Abraham. You understand? You know what I mean? So the other ones are found in Baghdad. That's the actual city of Babylon. Another city in Babylon, which I can't even pronounce. And then also in Khuzestan and Sialk, which is just east from the ancient Babylon. So this area was known for these towers during this time. Now, guess when, Tori, this ziggurat is estimated to be built in Ur of the Chaldeans? Well, at the end, during close to the time, I'm not going to give actual dates. I think that'll be stupid of me, but it's 2,000 years BC, the same time of Abraham, in the time that he lived in Ur. That's the time in which a king, and let me just get the name of this king. The king's name. Now, how did I miss the king's name in here now? It's got a weird name, so there's no ways I can actually remember it. No. Anyway, let me just go from here. So in the city of Ur, there was this massive ziggurat around the time. If we take the literal chronological age of Abraham, according to the Bible, in the same time, this king there in Ur was building a ziggurat, and guess who it was dedicated to? The moon god, Sin. And even the Bible tells us that Abraham came from Ur the Chaldeans, and that the moon god was the patron deity of that area. So there's a lot of alignment that's taking place here. So this ziggurat, this structure was built in the early Bronze Age, which is 21st century BC, like right in Abraham's time. And obviously, I'm not sure about the history from there on, but it gets refurbished, rebuilt, believe it or not, while Israel is in exile. So imagine this, that you're an Israelite, you're in exile in Babylon, and the greatest building project in Babylon is the rebuilding of the most ancient ziggurat in Ur. And now you have to write a story about Abraham and the Babylonians. It all kind of, it makes a lot of sense when you put those things together. So in the 6th century, it was built up by the last independent Babylonian king called King Nabonidus. And he undertook this process of then rebuilding the ziggurat. And just a little bit more information about it, you can still find it in Iraq today. It was then refurbished by a very famous person from Iraq, Saddam Hussein. Started a process to rebuild it again, but it was terribly damaged in the Gulf War of the 90s. Still has bullet holes. I think the account's 400 bullet holes in it. Right. Like it was kind of decimated during that time. All right, don't want to say too much about this, but it is terribly interesting to me, Tori, that biblical account, there's a historical timeline that runs, and the two dates for this ziggurat in Ur is the time of Abraham and the time of the exile. Historically, we know that. And there's the same ziggurat, one of the greatest ever built,
Yeah.
And this is the time of its building and the time of its refurbishment. So for me, it just makes a lot of sense to understand that the 6th century Israelite in Babylon is aware of this building of the tower so that the gods can come down, and is writing an ancient account in terms of that. That brings us to a very special man, Abraham.
Yeah.
So God kind of, in Genesis 11, God disrupts the Babylonian efforts to get to him, and he chooses his own method, a man. How is God going to come to humans? Not through that tower, but he's going to come through Abraham. And therefore, Abraham leaves the city with the Ziggurat dedicated to the moon god. He has to leave from there because God wants to do something new in Abraham. So you can understand how this is the story of the Israelites, understanding that their forefathers left Babylonian practices and followed the true God of the universe or of the ordered cosmos, and that he then worked with them through someone called Abraham. So yeah, it kind of works together quite well. Okay, so also consider that for the writers now of this account from the 6th century, the Babylonians have already sacked the temple in Jerusalem. So the Babylonians have come and destroyed their own temple. Keep that in mind. And they've taken, as far as we know historically, they've taken all the special and valuable things in the temple. They've taken everything to Babylon. So you can understand where the reaction comes from, right? This account is a polemic against the Babylonians and their futile attempts to reach God, even when they sack the temple of the true God. So it just adds a little bit of credibility when you realize that during the exile, the Babylonians were rebuilding this ancient ziggurat in the area where Abraham was from. Like the story it kind of ties together very nicely. So chapter 10 and 11 gives us 2 reasons for why people are spread out across the world and speak different languages. They don't really match too well.
Yeah.
They don't care.
Yeah.
Because this story about the Tower of Babel in chapter 11 is important enough for the Israelites. They have to show that the Babylonian religious ways are corrupt, that God will always work against it, and that God had chosen someone special that used to be there, used to be part of that, from which they were brought forth, Abraham. And that's the connecting point to this amazing man from chapter 12.
He's the solution.
Abraham, the solution, the way through which God would work. Now, if you read a little bit further, and we'll get to that. In Abraham's story, God does come down, but not to a ziggurat. He comes to walk in between the 2 covenant pieces in the covenant that he's making with Abraham. So God doesn't come down and bring blessing upon the ziggurats of the Babylonians. God only brings blessing upon the covenant which he has with this special human called Abraham. So chapter 10 and 11, kind of 2 stories of how people spread out and how languages developed. In chapter 10, they spread out as they are supposed to by being fruitful and multiplying. It's just a natural process, kind of seems like that develops. This yields 70 nations, which you said is a very interesting number. It also takes a good swipe at the later enemies of Israel. So in that chapter 10, in Israel predefine all the enemies under the cursed ones. Right. They're very interesting. Like it's something I didn't really think about before, which has become quite clear to me while I'm taking this approach. But in chapter 11, how the spreading out with different languages is kind of in a negative light. As a result of the pride and the arrogance of the Babylonians, this has happened. So the Israelites are kind of blaming the Babylonians for all the confusion that exists. Once again, we see that Babylonians feature strongly in the early stories of the Israelites. They are the true villains in the book of Genesis. All right. So the fact that there were 2 very different reasons for spreading of nations and languages, it's not a problem for the editors of the story. It's just not. It's just not
like the creation.
Yeah, it's just not an issue. So in chapter 12, we have a failed humanity meeting Abraham. Abraham then becomes the way for God to re-infiltrate this humanity that seems to keep on failing, So at this point, we meet Abram. His name is at that point. He's going to be the nation's father, the father of the nation of Israel. He comes out of Babylon. The world is a mess, but there's one through which God is going to clean up all this mess. God is moving from Babylon, which is chaos and confusion. He's coming to an ordered place again. So once again, it's the motive of chaos to cosmos, but this time not through a flood, this time through a man. So this time it'll be through another process through Abraham. So Abraham enters through the lineage of his father Terah. The part, as expected by now, starts with the descendants of Terah. So here we have our 5th chapter, ancient chapter, separator, and this is the story now of Abraham, this chosen person. Now, this portion about Abraham occupies a large portion of Genesis. Not half of Genesis, but a quarter of Genesis now, from chapter 12 to 25, is going to be dealing with the life of Abraham. Abraham is the most important figure, I think, in this entire story, because he is the transition between paganism and ancient Yahwism. He's the one that comes out of the Babylonians, the ones against all the rhetoric in Genesis, and comes into something brand new. And God in the stories makes himself known to Abraham and tests Abraham, and then brings out of Abraham an Israel. His grandson then, Jacob, becomes Israel, the nation. And remember, the point of Genesis is to give us a nation, Israel. Genesis is not about humanity. It's about Israel and Israel's enemies, their nemesis, Babylon, who they, in the 6th century, find themselves enslaved to some degree. They're writing a rhetoric of freedom, a rhetoric of not rebellion, but resistance against this world power at that time. So Terah moves with his family from Ur in Babylon to Haran, which is north of Canaan. And then unfortunately, Abram's wife, Sarah, of course, is barren. And this is a motive that we'll explore a little bit later on. The introduction is over. It's now time for the main course in Genesis. So you can actually look at Genesis 1 to 11 as a form of introduction. Setting the stage for Abram. By the time we get to Abram, we know who the villains are. We know who is blessed. We know who is cursed. We know a lot about the Babylonians, and their gods are like this, but the God of Israel is like this. Also, I have to say this, maybe a lot of people won't like this too much, but the first 11 chapters of Genesis is almost certainly forms of origin myth, right? In other words, although they might carry kernels of historical information, they are almost certainly generally considered as origin myth stories that carry deep meaning for the Israelites, but historically cannot be verified. By the time we get to Abraham, the type of stories change. Up into chapter 11, we have, it's more poetic, but when we get to Abraham, it starts to be more narrative. Prose, I think, is the right word, where it's now the story. And Abraham went there, and he had his, it's more story-like in terms of someone's life story, where before that it's creation accounts, flood accounts.
Legendary,
absolutely legendary Tower of Babel accounts. These are stories we find in and around Israel at that time that was readapted to set the stage for Abraham as an antidote to Babylonian religion in some cases. So it changes in chapter 12, and then obviously next week we'll be starting Abraham. And so as the introduction is over, it's time for the main course. Abraham, one who would be blessed, and he's also going to be blessing the nations. That's what we find in chapter 12. Well, that's the plan. God will use Abraham out of Babylon to establish something better in a new land. And that's where we end for today. So Tower of Babel, most probably ancient Babylonian ziggurats that Abraham would have been familiar with. And Abraham is pictured as coming out from those systems that God has rejected, starting a new system that God is now initiating. God's going to work with a person and a covenant with a people. They're going to be doing things differently. Lastly, it's just important to always realize that this is written from the perspective of Israelites. They are already dominated by the Babylonians. They already had their temples destroyed. They're already in exile during a time in which those ziggurats are being upgraded or refurbished again. So that makes the stories very alive to them, and it's important for them to tell those stories. And so if we keep that in mind, we're always going to understand why the stories look the way they look, because they're written from a point of submission to a Babylonian system and religious system, and they're pushing rhetoric to push back on that. Thank you so much for being with us today. And next week we're dealing with Abraham, right? The central character, I think, of the book of Genesis. We really want to think about it. So we look forward to seeing them. Father Abraham had many sons. Cheers.
Bye.